"Mr. Pate, how are you today?" The man sitting across from her looked like he was doing quite poorly. Calling him a man might have been generous, Dr. Winter saw. He was a large teen, probably still in high school, but his face bore the same look usually reserved for death row inmates. Though filled with melancholy, he had none of the trappings that usually accompanied children in their late teens. His arms bore none of the self-harm scars Winter usually found. He wasn't festooned in dark colors or piercings, and even his hair was unassuming. Still, something seemed to hang around him like a smog cloud, and Winter was curious to find out what it was. "I've had a pretty unique childhood, and there are some things I'd like to get rid of. I've talked to people who say you're legit. I'm hoping you can help me." Winter nodded, rising as she made him a cup of tea. Winter cherry, ginseng, and something known only to her created a heady brew in her nose as she filled the cup. When she handed it to him, some of his despair melted away. He took a careful sip, wincing as he burned himself a little, but smacking his lips appreciatively. You'll have to tell me where you get this when I'm done. I think this is the best tea I've ever had." "It's a special blend," she said, picking up her notebook as she took up her own cup and had a sip. "Now, why don't you start with what you'd like to forget?" "I guess it all started about 7 years ago, when I lived with my uncle on his estates. My uncle was kind of a weird guy. I lived with him for 2 years after CPS took me away from my parents. My parents were not what you would call reliable caregivers. They were more interested in pushing dope into their veins than caring for a child, so I was bounced around between family members after the state finally took action. Thankfully, I've got a pretty big family, and most of them are pretty reliable. My aunt is a photographer for a magazine, and took me for 2 years. I was 4 and still young enough to accompany her when she left town for business, but she feared that I wouldn't get a consistent education living with her. So, I went to stay with my grandparents for a while. My grandma was a loving woman with plenty of time for a growing boy and a curious child. My grandfather, however, was a grouchy old man who didn't want some young kid running around and making a lot of noise. I stayed with them for a few years until Gramps had enough of it one day and asked my uncle if he would take me. He agreed, so I packed my things and went to stay with Uncle Mark. One thing you should know about my uncle is that he's loaded. I don't know exactly how much he's worth, but he had purchased a small estate outside our hometown with 10 acres and a manor home. I have no idea how he made his money, but that leads right into the second important thing about Uncle Mark. He's nuts. Everyone knew it. Everyone accepted it. He wasn't nuts in the traditional way, the kind that will get you put away forever. Uncle Mark just believed in some rather outlandish things. He believed heavily in the occult, especially their connection to important figures in the government. He'd talk for hours about the Illuminati or the Skull and Bones controversy, and he'd tell anyone who would listen about how demons and hell are as real as you and I. So, when a big black sedan pulled up to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and a guy with greasy dark hair and a neat suit stepped out to get my door, I assumed he was just a fancy cab driver. The man identified himself as Cassius, and it turned out that he was Uncle Mark's right-hand man. The drive wasn't long, but it seemed to last longer since Cassius said nothing. We turned off the road, and I could see Uncle Mark's mansion as it rose above the trees. It had once belonged to a general in the Civil War, my uncle told me multiple times, and he had spent a fortune restoring it to its glory days. People were milling about when we pulled up, and I pressed my nose against the glass as I counted about 10 men and women in sand-colored robes going about their tasks. "Who are they?" I asked, nose still pressed against the glass. "They are your uncle's disciples. He's gotten quite a following in our community, and some people like to live close so they can receive his wisdom. I had about 1,000 questions, but Cassius was around the car and opening my door before I noticed he'd stopped it. He showed me inside, and the house looked more like a museum than a home. The more I saw, the more excited I became. It looked like a house from an old movie, everything being lacquered wood and old soft furniture. A fire was burning in the grate, and I could see more of the robed people as they cleaned. I'd thought maybe there were a few families here, 5 or 10 people at the most. But the more I saw, the more I realized that there were more people here than I'd imagined. We went upstairs, Uncle Mark wanting to have a look at me, and when Cassius pushed open the door to my uncle's library, I got my first look at Uncle Mark as he sat in his element. He smiled and welcomed me warmly to my new home. "It's good to see you, my boy. I'm glad we can finally speak candidly." I'd only met my Uncle Mark a handful of times, but I knew my dad was a little bit scared of him. He said Uncle Mark was always into weird stuff when they were growing up, and if a smack addict is afraid of you, there's gotta be a pretty good reason. The few times I'd met him, he seemed like a nice enough guy. Uncle Mark always asked weird questions, like if I could read or if I could see strange things, but I always figured he was just having the same problems my parents were. Dad said all kinds of weird stuff when he was high, so I assumed these interactions were normal. Living with Uncle Mark showed me that these things were only normal for Uncle Mark. I tried to pay attention as my uncle told me about his home, but I couldn't stop looking around at the mountain of books that surrounded me. I'd taught myself to read, though my mom had helped a little. It gave me something to do while my parents lived in a warm haze. I loved books, and I was a voracious reader. I wanted to explore this place filled with so many new experiences, but I'd begun to notice that many of them looked strange. Quite a few were written in languages I couldn't read, but that made me want to learn all the more. "You like books, do you?" he said, and his laugh was rich and genuine. "Seems you and I share a similar desire for knowledge." I turned back to him, afraid of the coming slap or the yell that would ring through my head, but he just smiled at me, no clouds darkening his mood. I think I truly saw him for the first time then. He was dressed like a sultan, his white robes covered in strange symbols, and his pointy shoes were up on the ottoman. He was drinking something from a real glass and being attended to by people who wore the same brown robes the others did. He told me that he'd been looking forward to meeting me for years, and it was the first time I think someone other than my aunt or maybe my grandma had been genuinely happy to have me around. I told him we had met a few times before, but Uncle Mark said he'd been waiting to meet me properly. "Your father and I never really got along, but I could tell that you were a little brighter than your parents. They kept you from me because they were afraid I'd tell you the truth. I'm glad that you finally found your way to listen." That was the start of my education. Uncle Mark and I talked a lot that day, and he explained what he wanted for me. Uncle Mark had created a paradise for himself here, but it had come at a price. He could not have children and would have no one to carry on his legacy when he was gone. He wanted to teach me his ways, teach me the things that had brought him success, and in exchange, I would inherit his legacy when he passed on. But only if you learn the things I have to teach. I can make you better than you were, better than where you've come from, but you must be willing to learn. I told him I wanted to learn, not knowing what that terrible knowledge would be. I would learn in time. Uncle Mark took me out of school, deciding to homeschool me instead. I'd been a good student. I'd mostly received A's and B's, but Uncle Mark's lessons were a little different. He still taught me math and English, but the history lessons were more of an arcane variety. He taught me about witch trials, the beginnings of secret societies, practitioners of actual magic, as he called them, and many other things I'd never heard of. He taught me to read the books he kept in the library, too, and seemed happy when I took to languages like a sponge. They say kids will do that, but I look back now and see that some of the languages were so archaic that it should be impossible for anyone to read them. I never had to take any of the tests that I had to take back in school, and I think now that Uncle Mark must have been bribing someone to keep them from having a closer look at his curriculum. It wasn't like going to Hogwarts or anything. Uncle Mark told me that real capital M magic takes years to cultivate, and I needed to build a foundation before I was ready to do spell work. He believed I'd be ready in a few years, and my days were spent poring over old books and learning runes and sigils in languages I came to be very familiar with. This went on for years and culminated one night when he called me to the basement. I came down at moonrise, not an uncommon time for Uncle Mark to teach me lessons. I found a bunch of his disciples making symbols on the ground with chalk, as others used crowbars to chisel open canals in the stone. Some of them I understood, but many were things I had never seen before. Uncle Mark held court over all, nodding here and telling them to fix little things there. When he saw me, he put a hand on my shoulder and cast his other hand out like a game show host showing off prizes. He seemed to be waiting for me to say something, but I wasn't sure what he wanted. I was 12 after all, and all this was a little new to me. "Well?" he finally said, looking a little perturbed. "It's, pretty cool, Uncle Mark." "Pretty cool?" he asked skeptically. "It's a little more than pretty cool, my boy. As my apprentice, I would expect you to recognize a greater circle of binding." That got my attention. Uncle Mark had taught me about circles. Some of them were used for protection, some of them were used to channel things, and some of them were used to hold things, if you could get them inside. This one, it appeared, was one of the latter variety. I didn't know what Uncle Mark was trying to catch in his circle, but everything I had read made me think it might be a bad idea. "What are you gonna try to catch?" I asked, unable to help myself. "A demon," he said almost casually. He must have heard me suck in breath, because I pretended to cough when I felt him look at me. I'd been learning about all these things, but I wasn't really sure I believed any of them. I'd watched my uncle do some pretty cool tricks, but I'd never actually seen him do magic. Parlor tricks, things you could see on any Las Vegas show stage, sure, but nothing like Lord of the Rings or anything. He was a good enough manipulator to convince people he could do magic, but I always figured that was about as far as it went. Is it safe?" I asked, and for good reason. All the books Uncle Mark had in his library about demons made them sound dangerous and temperamental. Priests would sometimes banish demons back to their plane of existence, and warlocks sometimes pressed them into service, but demons were strong and usually best left alone. The idea that my uncle wanted to trap one made me very uneasy. "You're with me, boy. There's nowhere that could be safer." But when he said it, his hand tightened a little on my shoulder, almost painfully. Uncle Mark had never been cruel to me, but I knew he could turn mean if the mood took him. I'd seen him yell at some of his followers, even seen him hit a few of them, and I knew enough to know that I didn't want that anger turned on me. I shut my mouth, nodding along as I agreed with him. Uncle Mark had always been careful up to this point, but his sudden desire to show his power in some grand gesture was not what I was used to. Most of this probably had to do with Samuel. Samuel had been one of Uncle Mark's oldest followers, besides Cassius. He acted as the representative between my uncle and his followers, but lately, something had changed. He'd begun to tell people that Uncle Mark was a charlatan, and they should follow him instead, since he had the real magic. Uncle Mark could have just thrown him out, but that might lend some credence to Samuel's lies. My uncle lived comfortably here with his servants, and losing them might cut into some of that comfort. Thus, Uncle Mark would have to prove his powers. I watched as his disciples worked, observing in silence as Uncle Mark corrected their labors. The circle was made of different items, each ring a collection of something unique. The inside ring was silver, his followers heating the metal as they set it into the floor. The middle layer was gold, and they poured the molten liquid right into the stone ring. It was crisscrossed with veins of silver once it cooled, and gems were set into the hardening ooze at key points. The outer ring was the oddest of all, a circle of frozen water that seemed ever on the verge of sweating back into a liquid state. The combination of elements was impressive, but I couldn't begin to understand how they all came together. "When do you think you'll trap it?" I asked, watching the rings come together. "Tonight, I should think," he said, smirking at me like he'd just told the most outrageous joke. So soon?" I asked, hoping I had misheard. Uncle Mark's face grew stern as he watched them at their work. "It's time to put Samuel in his place." As the hours ticked closer to midnight, Uncle Mark assembled his disciples. Samuel was amongst them, looking smug as he watched my uncle open his battered old grimoire and begin chanting. Uncle Mark never said where he found that old book, but I'd seen it many times. As he spoke, the rings began to hum, and the stones in them seemed to twinkle with eldritch light. He turned to look at his followers, seeing the circle flare to life, and his smile was confident as his eyes fell on Samuel. "My students, I'd like to thank you for joining me tonight. I know there have been some amongst you who recently have come to doubt my power, but doubt no longer. Tonight I will demonstrate my ability for you by catching and caging one of the strongest entities of the 9 hells, a demon." A thrum came through the crowd, but Samuel pretended to yawn as he grinned at my uncle. Samuel clearly thought Uncle Mark would do no more than put on a light show for us. But he was wrong. Uncle Mark had clearly brought his A-game and meant to show us all who the real wizard was that night. He drew 5 others to the points of the star, Cassius opposite him in the order, and they began to chant and call out to something whose name could not be known to mortals. Demon names are strange. They sound furry on the tongue. They have too many consonants. Their vowels are not in ordinary places. The members of the circle began to chant the name, and the circle danced with fairy fire. As they chanted, the inside began to pulsate with strange light. I trusted my uncle, even revered him, but I secretly agreed with Samuel. My uncle was a man of means, and clearly this was some show meant to cow the spectators. He would call something from a secret compartment in the floor, I had no doubt, but I doubted it would be some demon from the pits. Most likely it would be someone in a costume, some convincing bit of prosthesis that, in the dancing firelight and the moody shadows of the basement, would seem very real and very devilish. The chanting and light show went on for the better part of half an hour, and many of his disciples had begun to fidget nervously. They had become slightly bored by it, and some of them might have even begun to think that Samuel was right. My uncle had meant for this to prove his power, but all it was doing was cementing in their minds that he was a fake. Samuel seemed unbothered by any of this. He stood with his arms crossed across his chest, smirking at my uncle as he dared him to do something besides stand there and embarrass himself. That was when Uncle Mark obliged him. The chanting stopped suddenly, and my uncle raised his head and uttered a single guttural word that the rest had been chanting constantly. It fell confidently from his mouth, and there was no slur or hiccup in his pronunciation. He spoke it with a practiced tongue, and it seemed to vibrate the room as he uttered it. Melisfrul Rhine. Suddenly, and without warning, an unearthly scream echoed across the chamber. In the center of the circle, a creature that defied logic had appeared. It was man-shaped, but bestial formed. Its head appeared to be that of a bulldog, but there was no happy lapping face on this one. Its body was something like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, set onto the torso of a silverback gorilla. It had 4 massive arms, 3 huge legs, and a set of wings that seemed to crackle against the invisible dome as they attempted to unfurl. It was the color of molten cheese baked into a cheap pan, and its skin seemed to undulate like a living sore. That's the closest I can come to describing it. Its dimensions and form were not of this world, and to try would be to do it a disservice. As the creature loosed another of those unearthly screams, the disciples fell to their knees and began to pray to my uncle to save them from this abomination. "Worry not," he said smugly. "He cannot hurt you. I have trapped him inside a greater circle, and he is mine to command." The demon flexed his arms, ready to test this, but as I watched, its eyes seemed to dart around the room as if it were counting. The demon relaxed when it saw how many were assembled, glaring at my uncle as if he were the most audacious thing he had ever seen. I didn't trust its sudden helplessness, and wanted nothing so much as to tell my uncle to release it before something terrible happened. I wish now that I had, despite the beating it would have likely earned me. "Are ye he who is known as Marcus Pate?" The demon's voice was deep and dark, and my uncle had to steel himself to avoid the shudder that tried to ripple up him. "Do you see? Even the demons of hell know of me." Whether the creature agreed with this statement or not, it remained quiet. It sat in the circle, folding its legs as it hunkered in the circle's confines, glowering at my uncle. Its dog face was filled with rage, and I sensed a quiet patience in it. The demon was a being of the burning hells, an immortal creature of another plane. It could wait for my uncle to die if it needed to, and I think it knew that. As I turned to ask my uncle something, I was suddenly aware that a small throng of disciples were around him. Samuel was amongst them, confessing his sins to Uncle Mark and telling him how sorry he was to have doubted him. My uncle played the magnanimous guru, but I could tell how much he ate this up. Uncle Mark was wise, but also had a deep reservoir of ego that enjoyed being placated. He generously forgave them, telling them how they knew better now, and sent them off to their assigned tasks. "Cassius, you may take the next watch of this one," he said, indicating the demon. "My young ward and I will take the first. Come by sunrise and bring your wits. He may try to trick you and gain his freedom." Cassius said he would be there at dawn, and they left, my uncle and I finding ourselves alone with this creature. Uncle Mark said nothing the whole night. He walked around the circle, observing the demon from every angle. He seemed in awe of his own daring, not quite believing it had worked. The demon studied him as well, its piggy eyes glaring at him with hatred. The creature's intentions were clear, and I feared what it would do to Uncle Mark if it ever got loose. I was still young enough that the thought of my own death was laughable, but Uncle Mark had been so kind to me and given me so much that the thought of something happening to him was truly upsetting. As the three of us kept our vigils, the creature turned his attention from my uncle to me. I was watching the demon as it followed Uncle Mark, when its head suddenly shifted on its thick neck to regard me. Its eyes bore into me, the doggish face holding a pair of suddenly captivating orbs. Those eyes seemed to promise me things. They told me of great prizes that could be mine, and when my uncle stepped in front of me, I glowered and tried to lunge around him. When he slapped me across the face, I shook myself, unsure of what had happened. "Don't let him hook you, son. He's a terrible beast, and lies are like manna to him." "I wish you'd turn him loose," I whispered, unable to stop myself from peeking under his arm at it. I don't think I'll sleep a wink as long as it's in the house." "Don't be foolish," he spat, suddenly angry. "This creature is my legacy, and I'll let all the naysayers and doubters have a look." The idea of letting people down here to see it filled me with a sort of dread. I didn't know what my uncle was planning, but I suddenly felt sure that it would go poorly. Uncle Mark began sending out invitations. Not emails, not phone calls, but actual invitations. They were these strange little cream-colored things with black traces on the edges, proclaiming that the holder was invited to a miraculous evening. It honestly made him sound more like a Vegas showman than a master of the universe, but he assured me that it was how things were done in his circles. They will expect a little showmanship for what I have in store for them. He sent them to everyone, it seems, rivals and friends alike, especially to those who had doubted him. Uncle Mark had been running in the circles since his late teens, and seemed to have accumulated more doubters and rivals than actual friends. Like Samuel, many looked at him as a charlatan, but he assured me that he would end all that a week from now. "When they see what I have in store, no one will doubt my power again." His disciples set about making the house ready for guests. Rooms were cleaned, new furniture was brought in, and many little display cases were set up around the house so Uncle Mark could show off his collection. There were wands, daggers, books, even items my uncle claimed were enchanted. These were all things he had found on his journeys, and he hoped they would lend credence to his claims. The demon stayed inside the circle, but I'd come to mistrust that placid beast whenever I had reason to be in the cellar. He never moved, never ate, never drank, and seemed only to watch those who were with him. That wasn't to say that he wasn't busy as well. In that week, 3 of my uncle's disciples killed themselves while on watch, one of them tearing out his own eyes and tongue. By Wednesday, Uncle Mark had taken to guarding him himself. The 2 of us sat down there for hours with the creature, and if Uncle Mark wasn't guarding him, then Cassius and Samuel had the task. Samuel was like a changed man after witnessing Uncle Mark's summoning. He apologized daily for doubting him, and there was no more talk of leaving amongst the disciples. He and Cassius seemed to be the only 2 Uncle Mark felt could be trusted to watch the creature, other than himself and I, of course. That's how I came to be in the cellar with him that night, before the gathering, and had a moment to speak with the demon. Uncle Mark had been awake for 2 days, and I was unsurprised to find him sleeping in his chair around 2 in the morning. The demon had noticed him too, and our gazes found each other yet again. I approached the circle, careful not to cross it. That would have been a big mistake, and one I would likely not have survived. Instead, I stood at the edge as the two of us observed each other. "Why do you let my uncle think he's trapped you?" The demon's laugh was like a stone falling to the bottom of a deep well. "What makes you believe he hasn't?" "I've been studying the circle for 5 days. I'm not as scholarly as my uncle, but I know it has some imperfections. I think you could leave if you wanted to. So why don't you?" The otherworldly creature blinked at me, and I got the feeling that it was really seeing me for the first time. "You might be smarter than the old man gives you credit for. Smart enough to know it's not a good idea to trap things you can't control." The demon sat back, grinning toothily at me. "Make sure that's a lesson you remember when you grow as old and as fat as that one." It indicated my sleeping uncle as it spoke. I let my uncle sleep, and the demon and I continued our silent vigil over the other. He would need his strength for tomorrow's show, and for what I suspected might be the biggest and brightest show of his life. They began arriving before sunset the next day. They all came whether they wanted to or not, enticed by the curiosity of his invitation. Some wore suits, some wore cloaks, but they all possessed the sort of fantastical assurance that my uncle did. It was in the way their faces pinched or their eyebrows raised when you said something they disagreed with. It was the kind of assurance that says, "Yes, yes, I know more than you, I've seen more than you, and the things that amaze you are things I see as I butter my toast every morning." They arrived in old cars and limousines. One even came in a horse-drawn carriage. But as night set upon the house, they all arrived. With the spectators in attendance, my uncle came down the grand staircase of his manor house like the belle of the ball. He was dressed in a long white cloak, stars and swirls emblazoned upon it, in a new crushed velvet suit that must have cost him more than some of the cars in front of his house. He shook hands, greeted all of them by name, and as his disciples walked around with drinks and food, he told some of them about the wonders he had under glass. Some of them were impressed, some of them simply nodded and smiled politely, treating the items on display like you might a stack of knickknacks at a garage sale. They undoubtedly had their own collection of strange antiquities, and his were nothing to write home about. No, they had come for nothing less than the show he had promised them. He let them mingle until the grandfather clock struck midnight. Then he ushered everyone down to the basement for what he promised would be the event of a lifetime. They all pressed into the small space, crowding around the curtain that Uncle Mark had hung around the circle. Some of the disciples stood around, politely advising the crowd that they not touch. When everyone was downstairs, my uncle stood before the opening and rolled his sleeves with a practiced flip. Like a magician at a child's birthday party, he pulled the curtain to reveal his grand finale. They all gasped appreciatively. A few of them screamed in fear, but they all looked at my uncle a little differently when they saw the demon he had trapped in the circle. I would later realize that even the people he had called friends had considered him a faker. They all thought he was charismatic, a real Jim Jones type, or maybe even another Herschel Applewhite. But when it came to magic, he was little more than a convincing performer. What they saw now convinced them that they had been wrong, and my uncle was the real deal. Immediately, the questions came. How had he done it? Where had he gotten the knowledge? How had he constructed his circle? They gathered around him like a flock of birds, their incessant questions increasing as my uncle told them that all would be explained. They wanted to see his grimoire, where they had found the name of the creature. They wanted to inspect the circle so they might duplicate it in their own environments. They wanted to inspect the demon so that they might have a better idea of his makeup. Could my uncle contain him so they could get a closer look? Could he destroy it while maintaining the body so they might inspect it further? All their questions inflated my uncle's ego, but that ego died as quickly as their questions when the lights suddenly went out. My uncle turned, trying to see if someone had bumped the lights, but when a glow rose up in the room, he knew it had been no accident. The glow came from the creature as he hunkered in the circle, and when he stood and unfurled his wings, the barrier did not repel him. Many in the crowd took a cautionary step backwards, but they were trapped in the basement, and all the space allotted would not have saved them. The demon's voice sounded huge in that small space, and every word he said will forever and indelibly be etched into my memory. Perhaps I can answer some of your burning questions, it said as it stepped over the first ring of the circle. This man has constructed no circle that will hold me. This man has constructed nothing that would hold the likes of me. This man is a charlatan, just like the rest of you. You all play at magic. That's why you call it practice. None of you can grasp an iota of the divine that is stored in my smallest finger, let alone muster the power to travel from your pitiful little dimension into mine. As he spoke, he attempted to step across the middle ring. To my surprise, and my uncle's credit, his foot stopped in the air for a count of 4. It was a minute thing, no more than an eye blink, but the ring had stopped him momentarily. As his foot came down on the other side, however, I knew that it had only been a piddling thing. The only thing he's done correctly was to call me by name, and I will give him credit where credit is due. His pronunciation of that abyssal tone was precise and enlightening. Truly, it gives me hope for your species, though not a lot. He stood between the middle and the final rings for what felt like an eternity, and I imagined that everyone in the basement was holding their breath. And why did I stay inside the circle of an underwhelming caster for so long? Well, it's quite simple. Everyone, above and below, knows of the deep insecurities and deeper pride of Marcus Pate. I can assure you, you fumbling pretenders, I wanted nothing more than to rip him apart and drink the squirt of mana that he and your little flock have. But I realized that if I stayed and made you think I was powerless, you would draw bigger fish for my dinner. Fish with more than a splash of mana. You are all pretenders, all bumbling apprentices before the power I was weaned to. But you were also, all of you, churning with stolen power, and I will feast well tonight. He stepped over the final ring, shattering whatever protection may have existed within it. The rest is thankfully a blur. I was nearly trampled by the crowd as it surged around me, and as they shoved me down, I felt one of the columns in the basement bang hard against my back. I ducked down, curling into a ball as the sea of people parted around me. I was pulled and pushed, but I did not get taken by that tide. I was content to sit on my rock as the river was cut by a pike, much too large to hold it. I remember the first warm spatter as it hit me. My hair was suddenly damp, and as a loud roar cut through the cacophony, I put my hands against my ears and felt my skull vibrate dully. I cowered through almost all the carnage. People fell around me, their blood making my hair and skin wet, and there always seemed to be more. The demon moved amongst them like a shadow, cutting and slicing as he came, turning them into a slurry. I felt his claws slice inches above my head more times than I could count, and when my hair wafted down around my ears, I realized how close he had actually come. The 50 or so people in the basement took forever to be shredded, though I remember it seeming to end just as quickly as it began, when the screaming and moaning had finally come to a low death. I opened my eyes and looked up to find the impossibly large demon standing before me. As I looked up into the urine-colored eyes, I saw my short life pass before my own eyes and was not impressed with the journey. I could feel his acrid exhalation on my face as he knelt to my level. It smelled like hell itself. "I have decided not to kill you, little one. I want you to remember 2 things as you go about your long and eventful life. The first is that your spark of mana is greater than your uncle could have ever dreamed, though you will need to tend it to grow it to its full potential. The second," and as his wet, squashed nose bumped mine, I almost shrieked in fear. "The second is that demons are not the playthings of the magically stunted. Tell them that my kind are not to be trifled with, and the next time one of you apes feels like you can stand on even footing with a demon, I will do much worse than this." He touched the column I was cowering against, and as the flames licked down it, I glanced up and saw them sprouting to the ceiling as well. "This house will be ashes in less than an hour. If you want to live, I suggest you not be in it." I felt myself rising, little as I wanted to, and climbing the stairs as I walked from my uncle's house. They told me later that I had burns on my feet, similar to walking through a bed of cooling ashes, but I didn't feel them while they were happening. I walked out of the house like someone in a dream, standing in the courtyard of Uncle Mark's palatial house as the flames consumed it. I stood there until the twinkling lights of the fire trucks came into view, and the men in the fire coats led me to the ambulance. My uncle's closest neighbor was 2 miles away, but they had apparently smelled the smoke and seen the blaze from their bedroom windows. I went to live with my aunt again after that. She worked mostly from home now, her job more relaxed than it had been. My aunt moved us here to Kashmir for a job with the local paper, and that's how I came to be sitting on your couch, Miss Winters. Some parts of my childhood are foggy. I've forgotten a lot of the things my uncle taught me, but many of the more practical things have wormed their way into my daily life. My teachers are trying to push me into a career in anthropology and antiquities, like my uncle. They think my knowledge of languages and certain old world customs would be beneficial to me in those fields, but I don't know if I want to invite those kinds of feelings in again. What if I become as bad as my uncle was? What if I fall into the same trap that snared him? What if next time I'm the one looking at the rabbit cage and thinking, will it hold a tiger? The young man looked on the verge of pushing the lump from his throat, and Winter hoped he wouldn't choke when she suddenly brought his teeth back together with a gentle hand. He gagged a little, his throat bulging as he swallowed his memory again. The cup spilled from his hand, and he looked at her in bewilderment as she stared back at him evenly. What did you do that for?" he asked, tears leaking from his eyes. She could tell that he wanted to be rid of this memory, had been rid of it for a wonderful moment, only to find that it would be with him forever. "I won't take this memory. I'll tell Juliet to tear up your paperwork. Don't come here again, Mr. Pate. I won't take this memory from you." Winter turned, and when he grabbed her arm, she turned back to give him the full brunt of her stare. "Why not? I need this gone. I don't want this terrible knowledge to—" But he stopped when he looked into her eyes. She wondered what he saw there. She wondered if it seemed familiar. "Touch me again, and I will teach you a lesson that cannot be forgotten. Go, take your knowledge, and serve your purpose. Study old bones and other people's leavings, who were much wiser than you, and spread your truth to those who decide they are wise." He tried to let her go, and when she grabbed his arm and pulled him close, she saw the cowering boy he had once been. "Demons are not your playthings, and you would do well to remember it." He nodded, his head flopping a little as he wobbled his acceptance, and when she let him go, he knocked his chair over as he scuttled from the room. Pamela reflected that she could have used the money from that session, but the lesson was one that needed to be taught. She knew creatures that would thank her for not scrubbing one such as him, even if he wouldn't. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you think you might be able to handle just one more creepy tale, go ahead and click on one of the stories you can doubtlessly see appearing at the end of this one. If you're not subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button too. Maybe hit that bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If, like so many of my patrons, you decide you'd like to get your spooky a little bit earlier, why not come on down to Patreon and have a look at some of the great tiers that I have. My $5 tiers get their spooky a little early, and they have their name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I make. If you'd like a copy of my latest book, there's a link below to my Amazon profile. I've got mini books. I'm sure you'll find one that'll suit you there. I always recommend Stragview Stories, as it's the one I'm the most proud of. It contains a large collection of prison horror stories out of Stragview, the prison that I've made in the Georgia hills. So, if you'd like to have a look, come on down. Before we go, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being my Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.